Good afternoon, and welcome to the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association's Perpetual Affordability and Community Control of the Land, Community Land Trusts in Canada webinar. I'm Dominika Krzeminska, Director of Programs and Strategic Initiatives at CHRA, and I'll be your host for today. Thank you all for joining us. Before we begin, I'd like to give you a brief overview of the webinar technology. I will then introduce our agenda and speakers for this afternoon's presentation. Today's webinar is in real time. You should now be able to see a title screen of today's presentation and be able to hear me via your computer speakers, headset, or through your telephone if you've chosen to dial in. You're currently all muted. We do this to minimize background noise. If you wish to ask questions, which we encourage you to do, you may type your questions into the question dialog box on the webinar control panel at any time during the presentation. Please indicate which speaker you would like to respond to your questions. We will address your questions at the end of the webinar. If at any point you're having problems with the technology, send us a message in the chat box on the webinar control panel, selecting Organizers Only. Moving on to today's webinar topic. Throughout Canada, the community land trust movement is picking up speed. The model proposes an approach to land that ensures perpetual affordability and community control of the land. Flexible, the model aligns with the existing needs and characteristics of the communities in which it is used, offering the opportunity to protect commercial properties, community gardens, co-ops, and single and multi-family homes from the speculative real estate market. This session will provide an introduction to community land trusts in Canada and the United States, and an overview of emerging initiatives that bring into focus a collective vision for community land stewardship. And now I have the pleasure of introducing to you our speakers for today. Marie-Sophie Banville has a master's degree in urban planning from Université de Montréal and a BA in gender studies and political sciences from McGill University. Former community organizer, she now does development for Vivacité's Société Immobilière Solidaire, a Quebec-based nonprofit fighting real estate speculation. She is interested in developing tools to face the affordability challenges posed by the financialization of housing. She's also an independent journalist who focuses on housing, planning, and professional ethics. Banville's pieces have appeared in various media outlets, including Planning Theory, Shelter Force, La Presse, Le Devoir. She's a columnist for Nouveau Projet magazine, and her essay L'Empire de l'éphémère received an honorable mention at 2017 National Magazine Awards. Joshua Barnt is the Executive Director of Parkdale Neighbourhood Land Trust, a community land trust in the Parkdale neighbourhood of Toronto, led by a group of residents and organizations trying to protect the social, cultural, and economic diversity of Parkdale by redefining how land is used and developed. John Davis is a city planner based in the United States. He is a founding partner of Burlington Associates in Community Development, a national consulting cooperative that assists municipal governments and nonprofit organizations in the development of housing that remains permanently affordable. He previously served as Director of Housing in Burlington, Vermont under Mayor Bernie Sanders. Community land trusts have been a prominent part of his practice, teaching and writing. John has produced several books featuring CLTs. He's also a co-producer for the documentary film Arc of Justice, telling the story of the first modern-day CLT, an outgrowth of the civil rights movement in the American South. Thank you all for joining us. Joshua and Marie-Sophie, I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having us today. This is Joshua Barnt speaking. I'm going to provide a little bit of an introduction for our session, and then we'll pass the mic off to John. And we're so glad to have John here. For those who don't know John, John is considered one of the grandfathers of community land trusts in the United States. So it's quite a pleasure to be presenting with you today, John. So first off, I'd like to undertake a land acknowledgement. It's something that we do at all of our meetings and events at the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust, and I think it's appropriate that we do that today too. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which our community gathers is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Métis, and most recently the territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nations. The territory was a subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Ojibwe and the Allied Nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. This territory is also covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. Today, the meeting place of Toronto, from the Haudenosaunee word Takaranto, is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work in this territory. Additionally, as a white man, I must also acknowledge my responsibility to undertake this work in a self-reflexive way that addresses the continued impacts of colonization, white supremacy, and many forms of oppression that impact community members. Thank you. So the topic today is a community land trust. So why don't we start off by just discussing the community land trust in brief. So the community land trust is a nonprofit corporation that obtains through purchase or donation and holds land and housing for the benefit of the community. While all community land trusts are different, they do share the value that housing is a human right. And they share a goal of removing land and housing from the real estate market as a means to preserve affordability. Today, the Community Land Trust is a proven and innovative model for community-owned land, equitable development, and preserving affordable housing. In the United States, there are over 350 community land trusts. In the UK, there are 225 community land trusts, and in Canada, we're aware of just under 25 community land trusts. In recent years, the growing interest in CLTs has pushed us to create a very new community land trust network in Canada. In 2017, we had our first gathering in Oakland, hosted by the American Community Land Trust Network, which is now called Grounded Solutions. So this is a photo of our first gathering, and we're really happy to all be in touch now. At this point, the Community Land Trust Network of Canada is an informal network where we are sharing between practitioners, sharing our experience so that we can continue to grow this movement. Currently, we're aware of 3 types of CLTs in Canada: sector-based CLTs, community-based CLTs, and publicly based CLTs. So I'm going to just speak about each very briefly. Community-based CLTs really emerge out of the US, and John will speak to that, so I won't go into too much detail, but they emerge out of the civil rights movement in the 60s and then spread through the US in the 80s as a response to urban renewal, displacement, and gentrification in urban areas. The CLT is imagined in that context as a platform for preserving affordability and also for implementing development without displacement. Community-based CLTs have some important key features. For one, they're implemented as grassroots initiatives, so they're initiated by residents for residents. 2, they often have an open membership, which means that people in that community can join and be a part of that organization. And then 3, they foreground community control. So they look at ways that through their legal structuring, community members can have control of that organization and of that land. One really nice example of a community-based CLT in Canada is the Milton Park community. So the Milton Park community was developed in the 1970s and 80s as a community response to urban renewal. It's been historically understood as a cooperative housing network. So it's a multiple co-ops, actually 16 co-ops and 146 residential buildings, which are sort of operated collectively. More recently, the members of the Milton Park community have started to understand that they actually operate their site as a community land trust, so they started to use that word. So what we see is that sometimes community land trusts, we're doing community land trusts sometimes when we're not fully aware of the historical links to the community land trust movement. And part of that in Canada is that we haven't had a strong movement that's been connected, at least as they have in the US. So to move on, we also have a significant amount of sector-based CLTs. So in the 1970s, the first Canadian CLTs were established by the cooperative housing sector. They were established primarily as a means to preserve the affordability of cooperative housing and to pool resources of isolated housing co-ops. There were multiple really important CLTs that emerged in that era, which actually began as the development arms of the co-op sector. One very important one, which you'll see on your right, is the Vancouver Community Land Trust, which has seen a resurgence in recent years. Currently, the Vancouver Community Land Trust has over 3,000 units under development, and you'll see the byline at the top. The Community Land Trust will build 1,000 plus affordable housing on land contributed by the city of Vancouver. So that Community Land Trust is a sector-based land trust that was created by the co-op housing sector in British Columbia, but which has seen a resurgence in growth in this period. Key features of these sector-based land trusts are that they're generally sponsored by the sector. So again, with the Vancouver Community Land Trust being created by the BC co-op sector organizations. They also have a development focus, so they really take on the more complex work involved in affordable housing, such as specifically the development process and asset management in the long run. And one important factor is that they have limited membership. So co-ops already have a way by governing structure by which their members are involved in decision making. And what differentiates sort of co-op land trusts in Canada from many of the other community land trusts in the US is that they limit their membership to co-op members, where many land trusts or community-based land trusts will allow members in the community at large to join those boards or to join the membership. Here's another one in Toronto. Co has over 4,000 units in 2 community land trusts that are operated partially by the Co-op Housing Federation of Toronto. And then in Calgary, Homespace, which has over 492 units in 27 buildings throughout Calgary, and which provides housing to supportive housing organizations. So this is one of the really important community land trusts that emerged to actually provide housing for people who need supports. And so it's important that we recognize that the CLT is useful in that context as well. The last type of CLT that we were going to recognize in Canada was publicly based CLTs. So these are set up through government legislation to oversee the implementation of public policy relating to land and housing. So one great example is the Toronto Island Residential Community Land Trust, which was similar to Milton Park. It was created as a result of community organizing against the demolition of their homes. And as part of that struggle, the residents were able to win the right to stay in their homes through a land trust model and an arrangement with the province. And so the key features of publicly based CLTs are that generally they have limited or no membership on their limited or no membership. So membership is limited to either to the specific residents or beneficiaries of that housing, or in some cases there's actually no formal membership structure. Also, publicly based CLTs generally have boards which are appointed by government and involve government officials, and so there's less transparent democratic governance in these contexts, and it's more of a bureaucratic governance process. There's some additional really important key features of community land trusts, which I'm not going to go into in detail. I'm hoping that John will touch on them throughout his presentation, but I'm just going to mention them very quickly. So we have dual ownership. So the idea that the ownership of the land is separated from the improvements or the housing. We have the idea of perpetual affordability. We have community control, democratic governance through a tripartite board, flexible development, so not just housing, but also all types of development that might benefit a community, and expansionist development. So where co-ops differ from many where community land trusts differ from co-ops is that they have an interest in expanding to continue to benefit their community or the area which they serve, while co-ops are generally focused on assuring that there's long-term effective management of those co-ops, those specific co-ops. So that's the end of the introduction, and so now we're going to pass it off to John, who's going to talk about community land trusts in the American context. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joshua. John, I've just passed on the presenter role to you.
All right, are you able to see my screen?
Absolutely.
Oh, I'm so glad. So this is John Davis. Good afternoon. I've been asked to talk about community land trust in the United States. And on the screen, hopefully, you will see the 3 topics that I plan to touch on. That is where the model came from, how CLTs are typically structured, and why we do it this way. and why city governments in the US are increasingly choosing to support our efforts. But let me quickly say that I know very little about the politics, the policies, or programs for creating affordable housing in Canada. So I do not presume that our experience in the US is entirely relevant to your experience or situation in Canada. The how and why of CLT development in Canada may end up looking very different than CLT development down here. So to the question of where the CLT came from, Joshua already touched on this. It was born in the civil rights movement in the American South. The first modern day CLT was formed in 1969 as a vehicle for providing residential and economic independence for African American families in rural areas. Since that time, the number of CLTs has trended steadily upward, now approaching 300 or plus, depending on how you count an organization being a CLT. It's been spreading to cities, suburbs, and towns across the United States. Now, it's also been spreading to other countries from the United States. Other countries have picked up this model. And that's appropriate because, in fact, we stole some of our best ideas from other countries. The model that appeared in Southwest Georgia in 1969 was a hybrid, combination of earlier ideas and experiments that were drawn from the garden cities of England, from leasehold systems in Israel and Australia. The capital city of Australia, Canberra, is built on leased land, and from the Gramdan movement in India. Now, CLTs in the United States, just as they are in Canada, aren't all structured exactly the same. They're not named exactly the same. So there's a lot of variation. But if I had to kind of pick one phrase, the elevator speech that most CLTs in the US would subscribe to, it would be this: community-led development on community-owned land of homes that remain permanently affordable. And these phrases correspond to each one of the features, the key features of the Community Land Trust, as we think of it down here as the classic Community Land Trust. A lot of variety, a variety of features within each one of those circles, but the real power, the real genius of the model is the combination. All of these elements working in sync and the synergy when you combine these elements. Joshua mentioned that the basic approach to ownership is that it's a two-party model where you have one party, a nonprofit organization that owns the land, and then some other party that owns the structural improvements on that land. And a ground lease, a long-term 99-year ground lease that ties these interests of the landowner and the building's owner together. Now, the example I've got here is a single-family detached house, and many CLTs do indeed develop single-family houses on detached separate parcels of land. But this is a model that combines easily and readily with other types and tenures of housing. So in the US, we also develop limited equity condominiums, cooperatives, and a lot of rental housing on community-owned land that's controlled by a community land trust, as well as non-residential development. It's not just about housing. Basically, anything you can do with land, anything you can build on land can be done, and somewhere is being done by a community land trust. So the key question is, why do we hang on to the land rather than selling it off along with the structural improvements? And it has to do with giving a community-based organization the power to basically determine what happens to the land and who is served by the land and for how long that service continues, how long those benefits of equitable development endure. And when we talk about community land trust in the United States, we never separate those two elements. Equitable development and sustainable development go hand in hand. They are two sides of the same coin. The vehicle by which we implement sustainable development is by preserving the affordability of the buildings on the land trust land, preserving the quality of the buildings, and protecting security of tenure of the people who occupy those buildings. So even though the community land trust does not own the structures, through the vehicle of the ground lease, it can impose a durable set of controls that protect the affordability, quality, and tenure. So it's about the money, it's about the building, it's about the people. We are the developer that doesn't go away, according to one of the leaders of the CLT movement down here. Now, many community land trusts, I would say in the early days, most were actually created as brand new nonprofit corporations, kind of bottom-up approach, came from community organizing, mobilizing people at the grassroots. And they were structured precisely the way that Joshua described, with a membership-based organization. The membership nominates and elects a majority of the seats of the board, and a board with a balance of interests so that no one interest group has dominant control over the governance of the organization, puts a premium on public talk and transparency and negotiation. But over the last 10, 15 years, an increasing number of community land trusts in the United States have actually been created by existing organizations, pre-existing organizations that either convert themselves to a community land trust or spin off a CLT after the CLT gets started, or grafts a CLT program or subsidiary onto their existing operation. So community development corporations, Habitat for Humanity affiliates are in fact creating community land trust as internal programs of the CLT, of their own organization rather. The major growth of community land trust in the United States over the last 20 years has come because city governments have gotten into the game. I helped to co-author a couple of publications about community land trust. And back in 1982, a book that was published by Rodale Press looked at this question of city involvement, governmental involvement in supporting CLTs. And, the best we could say at that time was that the relationship was marked by benign indifference. In 2008, I co-authored another report that was published by the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. And at that point, we looked at the relationship between cities and CLTs. And we said, a growing number of cities are not only supporting community land trust, but they are actively initiating them. So why? Why have city governments become so instrumental to the role of supporting or even helping to initiate, to start CLTs? Well, it's because most of the housing programs and policies that we enacted in the United States for supporting neighborhood revitalization, producing affordable housing for over 50 years have had expiring affordability controls. So we pour dollars into our system. We use the dollars, we use the powers of government to help create affordable housing. But as fast as we create the affordable housing, it leaks out into the market. Water doesn't rise in a leaky bucket. And I think that is one of the realizations at the local level that city governments have come to that say, we don't have enough dollars. We don't have enough powers. We don't have enough surplus land to create affordable housing. We've got to do something to make sure that it doesn't leak away. Here is a little profile of the major housing production program that we use in the United States these days to create affordably priced rental housing for low-income people. It's called the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. And one of my colleagues just plotted the loss of units that we can expect in the next 10 years from that program, because that program only has 15-year affordability controls or the maximum 30-year affordability controls. So we're losing these units almost as fast as we create them. And when we lose those units, it's not only about the units themselves, it's the impact on the neighborhoods in which that housing is located. So we lose stability and we lose diversity in those neighborhoods. So what we are working against is a trend, a market trend, and housing policies that in both hot markets and in cold markets, we lose a lot of units. Community land trusts are designed to try to preserve affordability, promote replacement and repair in the existing units, and prevent foreclosures in a down market, what we call the three faces of stewardship. Now, there are a lot of models and mechanisms that have stewardship as part of their commitment or long-term affordability as part of their goal. What we've discovered is the community land trust is particularly effective, however, in kind of enforcing, implementing the three faces of stewardship. Because in the US, there are particular precedents and laws that mean that if you embed these protections in ground leases, they are more durable and enforceable than if you put them in covenants or some other mechanisms. The landowner is in the deal forever. And basically, that landowner has to be concerned with what happens to the structural improvements on the land. I was a city official for 10 years. Investing in our local community land trust. And I particularly like the fact that if something was going wrong, that organization could not walk away from the deal. They were basically stuck in that I could go to them and say, you've got to protect affordability, you've got to protect the structures, you've got to prevent foreclosures. So the reason that both community organizations and city governments have gotten into the game and are adopting this model in the US is to close the holes in the leaky bucket, to protect the units that we create, and to try to invest in low and moderate income neighborhoods without displacing the people who live there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. I am going to move on, actually go back to Joshua now. Joshua's going to speak more about Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust. I'm going to pass on the floor to Josh, and just like to remind you that throughout the presentations, you could be typing in questions into the question dialog box that's found on the GoToWebinar control panel. We'll address all these questions at the end, but just to make sure that your questions get in, just you can type them in whenever they come up in your. Okay, thank you, Joshua. Joshua, I think you're still muted.
Can people hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Great. So as I mentioned before, I'm also the staff member for the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust in Toronto, Ontario. We are a grassroots community-based CLT established as a response to gentrification, and we have a focus on neighborhood affordability. I'd like to tell the story of our community land trust through the stories of a few of our members. This is Sonam Yangzam, and I'm speaking about the middle-aged woman on the right slide with the green shirt. Sonam was a farmer in the mountains of Nepal and India. Her family worked the land for their own subsistence. Back in India, her biggest fear were the elephants who occasionally emerged from the forest to devour and trample her crops. Sonam is now living as a refugee in the Toronto neighborhood of Parkdale. In this changing neighborhood, her fear of elephants has been replaced by the forces of gentrification and displacement. In Sonam's adult ESL class 11 years ago, a discussion exposed that many of the fellow new immigrants struggled with the layered challenges of food and housing insecurity. Sonam and her classmates had many skills, including farming, but lacked affordable access to land. Miraculously, the class identified a vacant lot close to the library, engaged the private owner, and successfully negotiated a temporary use for a garden. With Sonam in the lead, 30 gardeners have worked collaboratively to produce over 1,000 pounds of food a year for their own use. But if we fast forward, after 7 years of production, the owners of this land decided to sell the property. The neighborhood of Parkdale has been changing faster than ever. New luxury condo developments are on their way, and many working class community members have had to fight through rent strikes to keep their rents affordable. In South Parkdale, 90% of our residents are renters, and 36% of households live below the poverty line. In our neighborhood, it's a classic story. When property values go up, lower profit land uses and lower income people often get pushed out. As a result, Sonam's access to land was again at risk. We assert that in the neoliberal city, we are in a struggle over land. Too often, people don't have the power and thus don't have a say about what happens to the land. But it doesn't have to be this way. We propose a model of community ownership of the land. So in Sonam's story, this is where the Land Trust came in. The Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust had recently been established by 7 local organizations as a response to gentrification. The trust partnered with a local environmental charity, Green City, and secured the 7,000 square foot piece of land for community use. First, we negotiated a below market purchase from the owner. Then we raised money for the acquisition and site planning through a community donor drive, as well as grants from local foundations. And finally, we led a community planning process with diverse residents to identify a new plan for the redevelopment of the site as a dedicated urban agriculture hub for Parkdale. This is the rendering of the space and our hopes for the redevelopment. We haven't yet begun that redevelopment, but we recently received the first large portion of capital funding to make it possible. Since we've purchased the land in 2017, the Land Trust has provided a long-term land lease to Green City, that environmental charity I mentioned earlier, and the intention is that that organization will undertake the redevelopment as well as program the site in the long term. So this was a major win. Not only does Sonam have secure access to this land moving forward, but Sonam has joined our board, and as a board member of the Land Trust, Sonam is now a leader in a broader community conversation about land use and community benefit. Her participation has been supported by a board supporter, also the Tibetan young woman to her left in the black shirt, who's also named Sonam, acts as her interpreter and provides simultaneous interpretation between Tibetan and English and Tibetan for all our meetings. For us, this is a huge success story and represents equitable development, which we hope to replicate. So how does our model work more generally? And again, we're speaking of a very community-based community land trust. So legally, the organization exists of a nonprofit CLT as well as a charitable CLT, which operates alongside it. The nonprofit CLT can undertake partnerships with all types of organizations, social enterprises, nonprofits, co-ops, but the charitable CLT can only undertake partnerships with other charities. And this is one of the legal challenges and limitations that we understand in the Canadian legal context around community land trust, that a charitable CLT brings the benefits of being able to raise money charitably from foundations and through charitable tax receipts, but has limited activity. So also it's important that we mention how we define community. We consider a community to be anyone who lives or works in Parkdale, so anyone can join. Currently, we have 600 registered members, and we focus our projects within this community, within the geographical area of Parkdale. Finally, we work to respond to the needs that are defined by community members. To set priorities, we collaborate with residents and over 30 local organizations through comprehensive community planning initiatives. We look not at the highest and best use that developers look at, but at trying to meet Parkdale's social values of diversity, inclusion, equity, and affordability. Our planning generally starts with a needs assessment, moves to collective visioning, and ends with action planning. Through planning processes, we have received a mandate from our community to undertake flexible development and prioritize multiple community benefits. Primarily, we're working towards affordable housing, but we're also working towards affordable commercial space for nonprofits, as well as access to community spaces such as the Milky Way for community economic development activities. Here are a few of our planning studies I just wanted to mention, because we find that planning is a very important and useful activity for a community land trust as a way to understand the community, but also to solidify what your plan is so it's transparent for those who want to get involved. In 2016, we published a broad-based community planning study which looked at equitable development in the neighborhood. Just recently, we've published a community benefits framework, which is a guide for development without displacement. It sets a set of demands that we expect from developers and investors in our community. We also undertake action research and publish planning reports based on that research with residents. So on the right, you'll find the No Room for Unkept Promises, the Parkdale Rooming House study, which I'm going to speak about now. Actually, before we move forward, I just wanted to mention how we have thought about our governance structure. John had mentioned that many CLTs use a tripartite model. We've chosen to use a tripart model, but we've structured it a bit uniquely. 1/3 of our board is represented by core members. So those are people who live or work on our land, the beneficiaries of the land that we own. Currently, that consists solely of gardeners, so gardeners in the adult DSL class, who have been elected by the other gardeners to represent them. Additionally, we have community members at large, so people who don't live or work on the land that we own, but who have an interest in a neighborhood and who live in the neighborhood and can sort of push the organization to continue to provide benefit for the community at large. Finally, we have organizational representatives. So organizations can elect representatives to sit on our board. And so we thought that because our neighborhood has such a great set of organizations, we wanted them to have direct participation in our governance and our strategic planning. So this talk is about housing, and I did want to talk about our housing plans. Here we have Lynn. I'd like to introduce you to Lynn, which is the lady you'll see in this photo, and then also her trusty companion, Bella. Lynn has called Parkdale her community for over 30 years, and she wants to stay. But over the years, it's gotten harder to hold on to good housing. Years back, she was priced out of a spacious apartment in a mid-rise building. Most recently, Lynn lived in a below-standard rooming house that was unsafe. But with her fixed income, there weren't many other choices. Well, that hasn't been easy to find an affordable room. While it was once easy to find an affordable room or unit in Parkdale, in recent years, rents have exploded and many rooming houses have been converted. Lynn and I have watched many of our neighbors, many with mental health and addiction challenges, lose their housing, and many of whom are pushed into the streets or pushed out of the neighborhood. Lynn knows that she deserves dignified housing, but where is it? Last year, Lynn joined the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust staff as a community-based researcher. Leveraging her lived experience and community knowledge, she and 5 other tenants worked with a dedicated urban planner to document the problem of rooming house loss and develop a local response. Our research showed that in Parkdale, rooming houses represent a significant naturally occurring privately owned, affordable housing stock. There are currently 198 properties in the neighborhood that we define as rooming houses, with a total of 2,700 units. This represents more housing than is owned by all social housing providers combined, including Toronto Community Housing. This means that rooming houses in private ownership represent an extremely important affordable housing stock for our community. Sadly, in recent years, 28 rooming houses have been lost to conversion and upscaling. The study documented the problem, and through understanding the problem, we decided we have proposed some solutions. But first, I did want to mention what's happening, because it's probably happening in other cities. Some of the folks on this call may be watching this happen in their communities. First, we're seeing retrofit gentrification, so the deconversion of rooming houses into single-family homes. So a building which may house 10 to 30 people is being deconverted for one household. We're also seeing condominium development. So this is a real article, and this is a real proposal that you're seeing in this. But This is a rooming house which has been purchased by a condominium developer and is being proposed to be redeveloped into a sailboat, condominium sailboat. So we're seeing condominium development displace this lower end rental housing. And then of most concern, and this is the trend that's impacting most units in our neighborhood, but we're seeing upscaling. So older rooming house owners are selling off their portfolios to speculative investors who are buying up these rooming houses and gentrifying them. So they're renovating the rooms and then getting out lower income tenants, doubling and tripling the rents, and bringing in a higher income tenant group. So in this process, we've documented that in the last 10 years, 350 tenants in our community have lost their homes due to rooming house conversion and loss. And so here's the map. You'll see that the gray buildings are those which have been documented to be converted, and the others represent other type, the other forms of rooming houses, bachelorettes, and nonprofit rooming houses. I must mention, and this links to what John mentioned around the leaky bucket, but that this crisis is actually rooted in 4 decades of disinvestment in our neighborhood. In the 1970s, our neighborhood received an influx of folks exiting the institutions, mental health hospitals. So psychiatric patients were deinstitutionalized into our community. They were promised housing and community care that never materialized. So in the absence of adequate public investments in supportive housing supply and services, a set of private entrepreneurs converted a set of old Parkdale homes into a unique stock of rooming houses, boarding homes, and bachelorettes. This disinvestment continued into the 1990s, and as supportive housing organizations who were working with tenants and trying to find solutions for all the people in need of this housing, supportive housing providers did not find that the government was willing to invest in the actual capital costs of supportive housing, but rather to provide housing allowances. And so supportive housing providers were forced to lease units either through master leases or through scatter leases from these private owners. And what we're seeing is now, as the market continues to get hot, that this housing is disappearing, and that's the leaky bucket. To speak more to the leaky bucket, our research found that rooming houses have received a significant amount of public investment, even though many of them are privately owned. Most of the rental revenue that is coming from tenants are actually coming from different income assistance programs paid for by the provincial and federal governments, OW, ODSP, OAS, that's welfare, Ontario disabilities, etc. We also know that additional housing allowances are being provided by the province to help tenants access the housing that they can't afford. And so this is huge in our neighborhood. We've tracked $870,000 a year just through housing allowances going to these private properties. Additionally, the city provided a property tax benefit for licensed rooming houses in our community, which gives these owners a 29 to 69% property tax benefit for being licensed compared to other commercial rental properties. Finally, the federal government for decades has been providing capital grants for improvements in these sites. So what we found is, speaking to this leaky bucket, that because these properties were placed in private ownership with no protection on the long-term affordability, at the stroke of a pen, years of public subsidy, scarce affordable housing units, and any value and equity that could have been in community hands can be lost. Again, this is a struggle over land, and our proposal is for community ownership of that land. Lynn and joined us and many tenants, supportive housing partners in the community, to co-develop a solution. We started by looking at other CLTs who are dealing with similar pressures of extreme gentrification in their communities. And so we found some really shining examples. And the Oakland CLT in the Bay Area is developing an acquisition model that's based on working with groups of tenants in buildings that are for sale for the land trust to buy those buildings for those tenants to be able to stay. So there's a direct relationship between tenants in rent-controlled sites or sites where there's affordable rents and the land trust responding by undertaking a purchase to secure that housing. The San Francisco Community Land Trust, also in the Bay Area, has been successful in securing 7 units in a similar model. And this has been made possible by a specific program created by the San Francisco City, the City of San Francisco, a small site acquisition fund. So the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust published this report, which was coined by Lynn Sky, which is called No Room for Unkept Promises. This reflects that the many historical failures of our government to address the concerns of rooming house tenants. and that we can't wait any longer for a real solution. We recommend both supporting tenants through proactive eviction prevention and response, but also the preservation of these sites through acquisition and rehabilitation of at-risk sites by a nonprofit community land trust. And so we proposed a 10-year affordable housing strategy in our preservation strategy in our community. And we're saying not only the community land trust needs to play a role, but all of the local housing partners and all of the local nonprofits who may be able to play a role. We've been successful in mobilizing 5 other partners to join this strategy, and we've raised over $700,000 in staffing dollars over the next 3 years to support staffing up this activity. We're working with the local legal clinic, with Wood Green Community Services, with Parkdale Activity Recreation Center, and others. So we see this as a shared activity, but the land trust is convening it. We've also advocated to the city to create a similar program to what we see in San Francisco. So we know that to acquire these at-risk sites, that we need public capital to make it possible and to make these sites sustainably affordable. And the city has responded to our demands, and they've created a pilot program to test out our proposal. So our councillor put forth a motion. It was passed by the local council, and we're looking to undertake a pilot program in the coming year. I'm almost done, and I just finished with the last 2 slides. I just wanted to let Marie-Sophie know that I'm almost done, so get ready. So we're currently working on a demonstration project of this initiative. Our proposal is the land trust can work to identify at-risk sites and organize the funding and financing to undertake the acquisition and rehab. The land trust would buy the property and own it in the long term, but would lease the whole site to a nonprofit operating partner or a charitable operating partner, such as a supportive housing organization. The land trust would preserve that land as affordable, undertake long-term asset management, but provide that nonprofit supportive housing organization access to provide the type of services that are necessary in that housing. So in a sense, we're replacing the private owners in our community who are now cashing out. We need to replace them to assure that that housing can be preserved in the long term. So currently we're going to take a demonstration project, and we hope that in the coming years we can see that successful demonstration project well documented and evaluated, and then we can implement a development pipeline to preserve more houses. Last thing I want to say is that while the land trust organizes the acquisition model, we know it's important that tenants in the buildings in our community need support, because land trust moves very slow. So Lynn Sky has been hired as a member organizer along with other tenants and other organizers in our community who have gone out and who are organizing tenant associations and supporting tenants in the 59 most at-risk rooming houses in our community. So I want to just emphasize that since community land trusts focus on ownership, they're naturally going to move very slow. So we need to be working in coalition with tenant organizing groups and other organizing groups to ensure that, while we develop those long-term solutions, that there's sort of direct service provision and support available to our community members. So we're organized, we're deeply committed to the idea that everyone deserves a home in our community. And through the community land trust model, we are working to redress past mistakes and to ensure that housing is preserved and stays affordable for current and future generations, because everyone deserves a home. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Joshua. I'm now going to pass on the mic to Marie-Sophie to talk about Vivacité.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so I'm gonna do full screen here. Great. Okay, so I'm very happy to be talking about the Clt model in Canada with Josh and with John today. The way Josh described, the different kind of Clts and public-based, sector-based, and community-based land trust. I would say that Vivacité, we are based in the province of Quebec, would be a kind of hybrid model between a community-based land trust and a sector-based land trust. We do not come from the sector, the co-op sector in Quebec. We are a non-for-profit, and we are a social enterprise. And basically what we are doing is that we are working right now to implement shared equity homeownership in Quebec and more broadly in Canada. So shared equity is a way for people to become, homeowners without having to put a down payment while we ensure the perpetual affordability of those homes. And the way we like to think about shared equity, for us, it's more than a tool to help people become homeowners. It's also a way to develop a more affordable and perpetually affordable community. So in cities and central neighborhood of bigger cities like Montreal or Quebec City, it's like what we love to call an ethical housing choice for the middle class. So it's a way for them to gain access to homeownership without accelerating gentrification in those areas. And in rural setting, well, it's a way to combat demographic decline by attracting families into more devitalized rural areas. So just to maybe give you a sense of where we stand on the housing continuum, here is the, you see on the screen, the housing continuum made by the CMHC, which goes from homelessness to, regular market homeownership. And it's interesting because John and Josh were talking about the way that CLTs can accommodate many different types of housing, from emergency shelter, like supportive housing, like what Parkdale is doing, to social housing, affordable rental models such as co-ops, for example, and affordable homeownership. In Quebec, we already have, I would say, good and effective ways to provide perpetually affordable rental housing through co-ops, through social housing, and models like that. What we found was that when we talk about affordable homeownership, we do not have sustainable, perpetually affordable alternatives. What we have are basically subsidies or where we give 5,000 or 10,000 to an household so that they can buy a house, and when they resell, then this house isn't affordable anymore. So, and more than that, I would add that sometimes the way the affordable homeownership program are designed in Quebec, and I would say as well in the rest of Canada, it can even accelerate gentrification, and it can accelerate household debt, because people are going to take larger mortgage with a small down payment. So what we wanted to do was to create a sustainable alternative to homeownership in the housing continuum, and met the need of the lower and the middle class, the lower middle class and the middle class. So if I was doing this presentation on in the US, for example, I wouldn't have to talk a lot about the mechanic of shared equity, because it's known, it's widely known from the people in the US. But I feel like in Canada, shared equity is not very common. So I hope that if some of you people on this webinar already know about the way shared equity functions, well, it's going to be a bit of known stuff for you. But for those of you who don't know how shared equity works, I'm going to work you through the mechanics of this model. And I think it's important to mention that the model we choose is really, really closely tied to the Champlain Housing Trust model based in Burlington, Vermont, which an organization with which John Davis has been very, very much involved with. So how does shared equity works? Well, by the way, I just want to say that for some reason, I cannot get numbers right in English. It takes me forever to say them. So I'm going to just say the numbers in French. So they're on the screen. So I hope everybody's going to be able to follow. It's going to be easier for me this way. So the way shared equity works is that, for instance, if you take a house that is worth $200,000, Vivacité, or the organization, would invest 20% down payment in it, which amounts to $40,000. And the thing that is interesting is that we are going to protect this down payment the same way a traditional community land trust is going to protect the land under the house. So basically, this down payment is not linked to the future owner of the house. It's linked to the house itself, and it's going to perpetually stay in that house. So I'm going to explain how it works, throughout time. So basically what happens is that we invest this 20% down payment, and a family who wants to buy this home has to then take a mortgage that represents 80% of the value of this home. So what we do is that we sign a deed of covenant with them, which is a legal contract that looks like a ground lease that ensures that this house is never going to be sold on the regular market again. And then we hold a second-rate mortgage. So the monthly payment for a house like that, including the membership fee, would be around $839 each month. And the family didn't have to put a down payment. So in a lot of markets and in a lot of community, it can look like what you were already paying as a renter. So from now on, it's your house, and it's your home. Vivacité comes back into your life, I would say, more strongly when there's a resale. So let's say that, after 5 years, you want to move for whatever reason, and the annual market appreciation was 2%. That means that there's a $20,000 market appreciation. And that's when I would say the philosophy of the community land trust comes in, is this idea that, if the value of your house appreciated, over the years, you didn't build that yourself. The reason why your house is now worth more is due to a lot of factors, including, the fact that the public invested in the neighborhood, that the parks are better, that the streets are better, that there's a good school, So it's this notion that you didn't build that. And it's funny because I was researching this morning because I was sure that this quote, "You didn't build that," came from you, John. And I Googled it this morning, and turns out it's from Barack Obama. So I kind of confused you a little bit with Barack Obama. I hope it's okay with you, but you get the philosophy behind it. So what happens then is that we will find new owners for this home who meets our qualification requirements. That would, there's a couple of them, but the most important are that the new household has to have an income around AMI. They have to be owner occupants, so we don't want to sell this house to somebody who's going to rent it for profit afterwards, obviously. And we want to make sure that, if we have the number of bedrooms looks like the number of people in the family, so that there's a good match there. What happens for the owner? What do they get back when there's a resale? Well, they get back what they paid on their mortgage, and they get 25% of the market appreciation. So if you look at the numbers on the screen, it means that you have a net gain of $27,000. And if you compare, if you bought that house with a 5% down payment from CMHC, you would save around $8,000, which means that your total gains are roughly around $35,000, which could represent, a down payment to go then into the regular market and leave your house for somebody else who needs it, or you can buy a bigger shared equity house or put it in your saving, whatever. It's your money now. Yeah, we can go back to that if there's question, what happens if there's a depreciation. What Vivacité does with the 75% of the market appreciation, the first thing we do, and it's super important, and that's how perpetually affordable housing is made possible, is that we reinvest a part of this in the down payment of the house so that it's still affordable to the next homeowner without a down payment. And if the market gets very, very hot and there's a lot of market appreciation, we could decide to reinvest more in the property and to say, okay, like even with 20%, it's not affordable anymore. So we're going to put a 30 or 40% down payment to make sure that it's still affordable for people who dispose of incomes around AMI. And what we do with the rest is that we make new development and we remunerate our initial investors. So that's the basic mechanic of how shared equity works. The way we want to use that tool, because for us it's really about creating a tool which help generate perpetual affordability in cities, in bigger cities, and in the hot markets, and in rural area, like I was talking to at the beginning. It's a way to face demographic challenges in rural area. The picture you have there is from the community of Lake Mégantic. I don't know if some of you heard of Lake Mégantic. It's a small community in Quebec which was struck by a railroad accident in 2013 that completely destroyed the downtown. So we are working closely with the community now to make our first project, which would be a co-housing project in the middle of the downtown. And it's very interesting because we also realize that this tool that which is shared equity could also be a tool put to service to support the birth, I would say, of the co-housing movement in Quebec. There's a lot of interest about co-housing. How can we accelerate this kind of development? So we feel like as a developer, Vivacité could very much help citizens who are interested in the co-housing model to build those type of habitat and making them perpetually affordable. What is I would say a bit interesting about the way Vivacité works is that we decided that I was talking about the housing continuum at the beginning, and you can see that people, I would say on the lower end of the continuum, they need subsidies to have access to affordable housing. Folks in the lower middle class, we were thinking, well, maybe if we can find a model that works without subsidies and just with impact investment, then we would not take money from the social housing pool, and we could do more of a social economy based model. So that's what we designed in the past couple of years. So what we have on the table right now is a plan to make 230 units within 5 years in 7 projects spread around the province of Quebec, the first one being, like I was talking about, in Lake Mégantic. And the way we designed it, and I think it's interesting, is that we designed a portfolio approach where we have different kind of projects who kind of cross-subsidize each other in a way. So the rural market project, the 10% you see on your left, is the Lake Mégantic project, which, let's face it, is not, a post-reconstruction market, is not a hot market. It's not a safe market in terms of real estate. So we were like, well, we can take those kind of risks because we're gonna have project in stronger market like downtown Montreal or downtown Quebec. So in a way, we kind of build a territorial solidarity between the cities in the province of Quebec and the rural areas. So, and I think another thing that is interesting about the model we're working on right now is that a lot of the down payment comes from our own developers' margin, because we act as the real estate developer. And we kind of apply the same philosophy that we applied for the sharing of the market appreciation, being like, well, when you build a house, you have your construction cost, but then you have the market value, and those numbers aren't the same. And we kind of said, well, what we build was, the house, and the fact that the value is higher than that, we didn't build that. So we're going to take that and we're going to put it back into the down payment, and so that the house becomes affordable. And the participation of the Mouvement Desjardins, which is a financial institution here in Quebec, was very key in getting that to work. So that means that the impact investment portion that we need is, in fact, it represents approximately 25% of the whole down payment. So yeah, those units that I was talking about, as you can see, initially it helps 240 households, but over time, you know, since there's a rotation and people often resell, so it's going to benefit to 850 families. So you can see how those properties get passed along over time. So as you can see, there's a strong focus on, I would say, building a big tool and using the community land trust model and the shared equity model to build a tool that would be able to rise up, I would say, to the challenge of the neoliberal city, and to really use the tool that traditional real estate developers are using and kind of hijacking them and diverting them back into our communities. So there's a strong expansionist focus in Vivacité, which needs to be balanced. And it's interesting because we're having those discussions right now with our boards as to how do we balance this kind of impact and the fact that our community is not a neighborhood like Parkdale in Toronto, for example, but is like, it's a province. So what is the community for Vivacité, and how do we want to involve this community in our government? So these are the kind of question and challenges that we are asking ourselves right now. So yeah, that's it for me. I'm going to open it to questions, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Marie-Sophie, and thank you to everyone. Fantastic presentations. So fantastic and so much information that we only have a couple of minutes for questions. So I'll try to get through as many as we can. And if we have any left, if the presenters are okay with it, what we might do is email them out to the presenters to answer in the next couple of days, and then share those answers with the participants. So a couple of questions have come in about the PowerPoint presentations. We will be posting the recording on our website in the next couple of days, so you'll be able to access that information there. So the first question, and I believe this one would go to you, Joshua, is, but if Marie-Sophie or John want to answer as well, that's fine. So in a Canadian Ontario context, what legal mechanisms need to be in place for creating a community land trust, one that may be publicly owned versus one that is sector-based? Joshua?
So what, just to clarify, what legal frameworks are necessary?
Yeah, are necessary to create a community land trust in the Canadian Ontario.
So I mean, I guess from a public perspective, the municipality could set up a new corporation, establish it as a community land trust, so there's currently already the legal framework to allow us to do that. The decision that the organization or the municipality would need to make is whether they want that entity to be a nonprofit organization or a charitable organization. In our case, we chose that we decided that we needed both. To be able to do the set of activities that we're interested in doing. So legally, it's quite easy. You set up a nonprofit organization, you establish your board, you set up your bylaws. You know, pretty similar to a normal organization. You just take the considerations, the operational considerations of the community land trust into account. And I think like what we've noticed, at least from the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust perspective, is that most of the things that make the community land trust unique are actually operational. It's how we do our work. It's how we set up our board. It's how we undertake our work, and then how we propose to structure the legal ownership of our properties, with the land trust having an asset, asset ownership and long-term stewardship of the asset, but then leasing the properties to other organizations in the long term.
Great, thank you, Josh.
One legislative tool that we do need in Canada, we don't yet have, but it's a federal issue, is we do need tax reform as it relates to private entities selling property to nonprofits. Currently, a private entity, even if they sell a property to a nonprofit for a reduced amount, it's not possible to avoid capital gains, et cetera, for that owner. So it's very hard to convince owners to provide good deals for charities or nonprofits, land trusts. There's currently legislation for conservation land trusts that allows them to provide some tax benefits, but we don't have that for urban land and for land with housing.
Great, thank you very much, Joshua. Our next question, I'm going to pass it on to John for this question. Again, anyone can snap in. How sacrosanct is the retention of the land? Is there an argument for selling some or all in order to buy elsewhere or access the equity for redevelopment?
Well, we make it very, very difficult to sell land. So you need a majority, you need a 2/3 majority of the board. You need the membership to affirm the proposal to sell land, but it is done. I mean, there is a loophole, there is an opening for a community land trust that would like to sell a high value piece of land in order to subsidize housing someplace else. I think what's sacrosanct is that any of the proceeds from that sale, any of the appreciation that is captured by the CLT is still going to be used for a social benefit. But generally, we make it very, very difficult to sell land.
Thank you very much, John. The next question I'll pass on to Marie-Sophie. We have two questions that are quite similar, so I'm going to mix them a little bit. So with the shared equity model, who is responsible for maintaining the property? What is the impetus for an owner to actually put money in real improvements, like adding a room, finishing a basement, or any sort of renovations?
Yeah, so the owner is responsible for maintaining the house. If there's a depreciation, they take 100%. So, that's an incentive for sure. But other than that, I didn't go into details for the presentation, but there's a policy that if you do, a maintenance that enhance the value of the house, those renovation the value of those renovation, we can have a contract together that stipulates that we recognize 100% of the value and it goes back to you. So if the market took $20,000 and then your renovation added another 10,000 to that, well, that 10,000 goes straight to you 100%.
Thank you very much, Marie-Sophie. We have time for probably two more questions. This one's again for Joshua. What criteria are used to identify at-risk rooming houses? In this market, aren't all rooming houses at risk? The question.
Very good question. So you're correct that technically all rooming houses could be considered at risk. However, we set a bunch of criteria that allowed us to pick the highest risk sites. And the criteria was developed based on the categories that the sites we've lost fall into. So sites that have 10 or more units, we consider to be at higher risks. These are properties which are more vulnerable to upscaling as higher income rental properties. We also identified any building in our stock through which we knew that the owner had expressed interest in selling or had the building on the market, immediately became at risk. So that's information we gathered through the research, speaking to owners and interviewing owners. And another criteria is that where we've seen evictions that are not just strictly a tenant-landlord relationship eviction, but rather which have signs of being speculative evictions, so trying to get tenants out to renovate units, et cetera. And sites where we see that, those sites become part of the at-risk list. So it allowed us to identify 59 buildings where we can focus our resources, both in terms of tenant organizing and legal education, but also in terms of monitoring those buildings, working with the landlord to try to find succession planning opportunities.
Thank you very much, Joshua. So we've actually come to the end of our webinar. I understand that I didn't get to a couple of questions, so I will send those out to speakers, and if they have the time, they'll answer them, and we will share the answers with participants. So apologies to not getting to some of those questions, but we will acknowledge them for sure. I'd like to thank the audience for participating, and to our speakers, Marie-Sophie, John, and Joshua, for presenting today. Today's webinar recording will be shared on CHRA's website in the coming days. You will also be emailed a survey about today's webinar that will help us here at CHRA with future webinars. Our next webinar is part of a new CHRA webinar series called Social Housing Around the World. The webinar will feature Wiener Wohnen out of Vienna, Austria on November 27th. Visit CHRA's website for more information and to register. Thank you again, and happy Halloween, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.